The ancient church of St. Mary's in Little Wickham had witnessed 3 centuries of Christmas Eve services, but none quite like this one. Snow had begun falling at dusk, dusting the Norman stonework and settling on the shoulders of parishioners as they hurried through the lych gate, their breath forming small clouds in the crystalline air. The interior glowed with the warm light of dozens of candles, their flames dancing against the holly and ivy that festooned every pillar and window-sill. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary pew, third from the front on the left side, her small, neat figure wrapped in a dove-grey coat that had seen many such services. Her blue eyes, gentle as cornflowers but sharp as pins, moved thoughtfully over the familiar faces around her. She observed, as she always did, the small human dramas playing out in the sacred space, Mrs. Rowena Pike adjusting her fox fur stole with practiced vanity, Colonel Hartwell checking his pocket watch with military precision, and young Dr. Pemberton's wife stealing glances toward the door as if expecting someone who had not yet arrived. The Reverend Mr. Clement, a kindly man whose sermons were mercifully brief, had just announced the final carol when a small commotion arose near the vestry. Mrs. Clement, usually the picture of clerical composure, appeared at her husband's elbow with an expression of barely concealed distress. She whispered something that caused the good Reverend to pause mid-sentence, his face paling above his white surplice. "My dear friends," he said, his voice carrying a tremor that had nothing to do with age, "it seems we have encountered a small difficulty. Our Father Christmas appears to have been delayed." A murmur rippled through the congregation. For 15 years, Mr. Albert Crowley, the village postman, had donned the red suit and white beard to distribute oranges and peppermint sticks to the children after the Christmas Eve service. It was a tradition as fixed as the church calendar itself, and Albert Crowley was not a man given to disappointing children or breaking promises. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. She had seen Albert that very afternoon, wheeling his bicycle past her cottage with his usual cheerful wave, his leather post-bag bulging with Christmas cards and parcels. He had called out something about making sure every child gets their Christmas wishes, a sentiment so characteristic of the man that it had brought a smile to her lips. Beatrice Stone, the postmistress, rose from her pew with the brisk efficiency that had made her indispensable to village life. "I'll check the post office," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the church. Perhaps Albert was delayed by a last-minute delivery. But Miss Marple noticed something others might have missed: the slight tremor in Beatrice's hands as she gathered her gloves, and the way her eyes avoided meeting those of Dr. Pemberton, who sat across the aisle with his young wife. Such small signs often spoke volumes to those who knew how to read them. As the congregation began to disperse into the snowy night, clusters of concerned villagers forming on the church steps, Miss Marple made her own quiet observations. She noted that Colonel Hartwell seemed unusually agitated, consulting his watch repeatedly and muttering about punctuality being the politeness of princes. She observed that Mrs. Pike's concern appeared theatrical rather than genuine, her pronouncements about Albert's reliability delivered with the air of someone who enjoyed being the bearer of dramatic news. Most interesting of all, she noticed young Timothy Fletcher, the mechanic's apprentice, hovering near the church door with an expression of genuine worry. Timothy had always been fond of Albert, who had taken the time to teach the boy about bicycle maintenance and had even helped him find his current position at Fletcher's garage. "Miss Marple," came a voice at her elbow. She turned to find Dr. Pemberton, his usually composed features creased with concern. "You know Albert as well as anyone. This isn't like him, is it?" "Indeed not, Doctor," Miss Marple replied gently. "Albert Crowley is perhaps the most reliable man in Little Wickham. If he has failed to appear, I fear something quite serious may have prevented him." As if summoned by her words, Timothy Fletcher approached them, his cap twisted nervously in his hands. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, Dr. Pemberton, but I saw Albert this afternoon around 4 o'clock. He was cycling up toward Millfield Lane, said he had one last delivery to make before preparing for tonight. He seemed a bit troubled about something, though he wouldn't say what." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. Troubled, you say? In what way, Timothy? Well, miss, he kept checking his watch, and he had that look he gets when he's working out a problem. You know how careful he is about his deliveries. Never wants to make a mistake. He said something about making sure the right person gets what's coming to them. Thought it was just Christmas talk, but now... Dr. Pemberton frowned. Millfield Lane leads to the old mill and then up to Rosemary Cottage. That's quite isolated, especially in this weather. Perhaps, suggested Miss Marple quietly, we should take a little walk in that direction. The snow will have covered any tracks, but one never knows what might be visible to the careful observer. As the three made their way through the village, the snow crunching softly beneath their feet, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of human behavior. Albert Crowley was a man of such rigid routine that his absence from the Christmas Eve service was as startling as if the church bells had failed to ring. In her long experience, when reliable people suddenly became unreliable, it usually meant that something or someone had made reliability impossible. The gas lamp at the corner of Millfield Lane cast a pale circle of light that revealed the first clue. Albert's red bicycle, lying on its side in the snow beside the old stone bridge. His leather post bag sat upright against the bridge parapet, as if carefully placed there rather than dropped. Most curious of all, a single Christmas card lay in the snow nearby, its red envelope bright against the white ground. Dr. Pemberton moved to examine the bicycle, but Miss Marple's gentle voice stopped him. Perhaps, Doctor, we should disturb nothing until Constable Edwards arrives, but we might observe from here. What she observed would prove most illuminating indeed. The bicycle showed no signs of accident or struggle. It had been placed, not fallen. The post bag, though clearly heavy with undelivered mail, bore no signs of tampering, and the Christmas card in the snow was addressed in Albert's own careful handwriting to someone whose name would soon become very significant indeed. As church bells chimed midnight somewhere in the distance, welcoming Christmas Day, Miss Marple stood in the falling snow and contemplated the first threads of what would prove to be a most intricate and deadly puzzle. Albert Crowley, the postman who had never missed a delivery in 15 years of service, had vanished on the one night when his presence was most expected and most needed. The question was not whether something had happened to Albert. That much was becoming distressingly clear. The question was what had happened, and more importantly, who in the seemingly peaceful village of Little Wickham had reason to ensure that the postman would never complete his Christmas Eve rounds. Christmas morning dawned pale and grey over Little Wickham, bringing with it whispers that travelled faster than the church bells, calling the faithful to worship. The discovery of Albert Crowley's abandoned bicycle had transformed the village's festive mood into something altogether more unsettling. By the time Constable Edwards completed his preliminary examination of the scene, declaring it suspicious circumstances requiring further investigation, every household knew that their reliable postman had vanished without explanation on the most important night of his calendar. The Christmas Day service at St. Mary's proceeded with subdued solemnity, Albert's empty pew serving as a stark reminder of the mystery that had befallen their community. Afterward, the traditional gathering in the village hall became an impromptu forum for speculation, with each resident offering theories that revealed as much about their own character as about Albert's fate. Mrs. Rowena Pike, resplendent in her fox fur despite the indoor setting, held court near the refreshment table. "Mark my words," she declared with theatrical gravity. "Poor Albert has simply had one of those peculiar turns that afflict bachelor gentlemen of a certain age. The isolation, the routine, it drives men to desperate acts. He's probably taken himself off to London, though abandoning the children on Christmas Eve shows a shocking lack of consideration." Colonel Hartwell, bristling with military precision, dismissed such notions with a sharp shake of his head. "Nonsense, Rowena. Crowley was steady as bedrock. 15 years without missing a delivery. This smacks of foul play." Mark my words at Ice, it's those new people renting the cottage beyond the mill. Never trust strangers who arrive without proper introductions. Beatrice Stone, the postmistress, sat apart from the others, her usually composed demeanor cracked with genuine distress. Albert wouldn't abandon his duties, she insisted to anyone who approached. Something dreadful has happened. There's the matter of the Christmas Club money. He was carrying nearly £50 in contributions, meant to be distributed today. Albert would never disappear with people's savings. This revelation sent a ripple of unease through the gathering. The Christmas Club had been Albert's private initiative, helping families save throughout the year for holiday expenses. The thought that their trusted postman might have absconded with their money was almost as disturbing as the possibility that someone had harmed him for it. Dr. Pemberton attempted to restore calm with measured words about allowing the authorities to conduct their investigation, but Miss Marple noticed how his young wife remained unusually quiet, her attention frequently drifting toward the windows as if expecting someone who would never arrive. Miss Marple herself moved quietly through the gathering, ostensibly distributing leftover Christmas pudding to elderly parishioners, but actually conducting her own subtle investigation. Her gentle inquiries, disguised as neighborly concern, gradually revealed a pattern that others had missed entirely. Timothy Fletcher, when approached with maternal solicitude about his obvious distress, provided the most illuminating information. Albert had been asking strange questions these past weeks, Miss Marple, wanting to know about people who used to live in the village, families who'd moved away years ago. Just last Tuesday, he inquired about the Hendersons who lived at Elm House before the Pikes bought it. Said he was setting old accounts straight and ensuring everyone got what they deserved. This revelation proved most significant. In Miss Marple's extensive experience with human nature, when reliable people began investigating the past, it usually meant they had discovered something in the present that required historical context to understand fully. Her conversation with Mrs. Weatherby, who lived near Rosemary Cottage, confirmed these suspicions. The elderly spinster reported that Albert had visited several times recently, asking detailed questions about previous tenants and showing particular interest in a Mrs. Elspeth Rowan, the mysterious widow who had taken the isolated cottage in October. He seemed quite troubled about something, Mrs. Weatherby confided, checking his pocket watch repeatedly and muttering about justice delayed but not denied. Most unlike our Albert, who never involved himself in village gossip. As Miss Marple walked home through the snow-muffled streets, she reflected on the curious fact that Albert's disappearance had revealed more about Little Wickham's hidden currents than years of ordinary observation might have accomplished. The Christmas Club money provided an obvious motive, but Albert's recent historical investigations suggested deeper waters entirely. Whatever had happened to the faithful postman, Miss Marple was increasingly certain it was connected to secrets that predated his Christmas Eve rounds by considerable time. Boxing Day dawned grey and subdued over Little Wickham, the festive decorations now seeming incongruously cheerful against the village's collective unease. Miss Marple encountered Constable Edwards making his methodical rounds, his notebook clutched against the morning chill as he documented every detail of Albert Crowley's mysterious disappearance with the thoroughness that marked him as a conscientious, if unimaginative, officer of the law. The evidence speaks softly. At the vestry where Albert's belongings had been secured, Miss Marple observed with the gentle attention that had served her so well in previous mysteries. The bicycle, propped against the stone wall, immediately caught her practiced eye. "How curious," she murmured to Constable Edwards. Albert was most particular about his bicycle maintenance. Timothy Fletcher mentioned that Albert always laid it on the left side to protect the chain and lamp from damage. Yet here it leans to the right. The constable made a careful note. Such details might seem trivial to others, but Miss Marple understood that when reliable people deviated from ingrained habits, it usually indicated external interference rather than personal choice. Albert's cottage behind the post office revealed further anomalies. The rooms maintained their characteristic bachelor tidiness, but subtle signs suggested Albert had been expecting company on his final evening. 2 teacups sat beside the kettle, one bearing the faint crescent of pale rose lipstick, a shade too refined for Beatrice Stone's practical nature, yet not quite matching Mrs. Pike's theatrical preferences. The Father Christmas costume lay carefully folded on the bedroom chair, suggesting Albert had fully intended to fulfill his Christmas Eve obligations. Most significantly, Albert's small black notebook, the detailed record of his rounds and observations that he carried everywhere, was nowhere to be found. His winter coat and boots were also missing, indicating he had dressed for outdoor activity. A single dark horn button lay in a shallow dish by the window, its attached thread suggesting it had been torn free rather than carefully removed. Official. Channels and unofficial wisdom. The arrival of Inspector Slack from county headquarters brought a different perspective to the investigation, though not necessarily a more perceptive one. A heavy-set man whose unfortunate surname perfectly matched his investigative thoroughness, Slack approached the mystery with the confidence of someone who had seen it all before. "Clear case of embezzlement," he announced after a cursory examination of the evidence. "These postal workers get access to other people's money and can't resist temptation. The Christmas Club funds provided the motive. The bicycle breakdown gave him the opportunity to disappear on foot." Miss Marple, gathering late holly berries with apparent innocence, offered gentle observations that highlighted the flaws in this theory. "How fortunate the solution appears so straightforward, Inspector, though I confess puzzlement that a man intent on disappearing would abandon reliable transportation for a dangerous winter walk, particularly when the Christmas Club money was later found untouched in his cottage." Inspector Slack's dismissive grunt suggested he found village interference tiresome, but his constable dutifully recorded Miss Marple's observations about the bicycle's perfect working condition and the curious placement of Albert's final delivery. The village transformed. The days following Christmas revealed how profoundly Albert's disappearance had affected Little Wickham's social fabric. Miss Marple, conducting her usual round of neighborly visits, observed the subtle changes that spoke volumes about hidden anxieties and suppressed fears. Beatrice Stone moved through the post office with brittle efficiency, her hands trembling slightly as she sorted mail, constantly glancing toward the door as if expecting Albert's familiar figure to appear. "The uncertainty is the worst part," she confided to Miss Marple during a visit for stamps. "Not knowing what's become of him, whether he's lying injured somewhere in this dreadful weather." Colonel Hartwell had transformed Albert's disappearance into a personal crusade against village disorder, striding purposefully around the green while expounding increasingly elaborate theories involving mysterious strangers and criminal conspiracies. Yet Miss Marple noted the deep anxiety lines around his eyes, suggesting his bluster masked genuine distress about threats to Little Wickham's peaceful existence. Mrs. Rowena Pike continued her theatrical lamentations about the tragedy of it all, but Miss Marple detected a subtle satisfaction whenever conversation turned to the new people at Rosemary Cottage. Having purchased Elm House from the Henderson family years earlier, Mrs. Pike seemed particularly invested in highlighting any perceived inadequacies among recent arrivals. The Christmas card's secret. The most significant evidence remained the Christmas card found in the snow near Albert's abandoned bicycle. Addressed in his careful handwriting to Mrs. Elspeth Rowan, Rosemary Cottage, it represented Albert's final intended delivery. But Constable Edwards' examination revealed troubling details. The envelope bore a London postmark from 3 days earlier, unusual for local correspondence, and showed signs of having been opened and carefully resealed, the glue line slightly irregular in a way that suggested steaming. Timothy Fletcher's additional testimony provided crucial context. "I saw Mrs. Rowan in the village a few days before Christmas," he reported to Miss Marple during an ostensibly casual conversation. "She appeared quite distressed, having what looked like an argument with someone near the old well. and Albert was asking questions about her just a day or two later, wanting to know about the cottage's previous tenants. Threads of the past. As Miss Marple walked home through the grey afternoon, she reflected on the pattern emerging from seemingly disconnected observations. Albert's recent inquiries about former residents, particularly the Henderson family who had once lived at Elm House, suggested he had discovered something requiring historical context to understand fully. His stated intention to set old accounts straight and ensure everyone got what they deserved indicated moral rather than financial motivations. The Christmas card to Mrs. Rowan, with its London origins and evidence of tampering, suggested correspondence that had travelled through official postal channels before reaching Albert's personal attention. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, when reliable people began investigating the past while handling present correspondence, it usually meant they had discovered connections between old secrets and new arrivals. Whatever had befallen Albert Crowley on his final Christmas Eve rounds, Miss Marple was increasingly certain it stemmed from his discovery of truths that someone had gone to considerable lengths to keep buried. The question now was whether Albert's commitment to delivering difficult truths had cost him more than anyone in Little Wickham was yet prepared to acknowledge. By December 28th, Inspector Slack had arrived at what he considered a satisfactory conclusion to the Albert Crowley mystery. Standing before the assembled villagers in the church hall with the confidence of a man who believed in straightforward solutions, he outlined his theory with bureaucratic precision that brooked no contradiction. "The evidence clearly points to Mrs. Elspeth Rowan of Rosemary Cottage," Slack announced, consulting his notes with theatrical authority. Crowley was last seen heading in her direction, carrying correspondence addressed specifically to her. She's a newcomer with no local references, no verifiable background, and, most significantly, she's been evasive when questioned about her movements on Christmas Eve. The announcement sent ripples of vindicated satisfaction through certain quarters of the gathering. Mrs. Rowena Pike nodded with dramatic emphasis, her fox fur trembling with righteous indignation. "I knew there was something unsavory about that woman from the moment she arrived. Living in that isolated cottage, refusing all neighborly overtures, keeping to herself like she had something to hide." Colonel Hartwell's military bearing straightened with relief at having a concrete target for his suspicions. "Exactly what I've been saying all along. These strangers arrive without proper introductions, then prey upon decent people like poor Albert. The woman should be arrested immediately." But Miss Marple, seated quietly in the back with her knitting, observed the proceedings with growing unease. In her extensive experience with human nature, the most obvious suspect was rarely the correct one, particularly when community prejudice aligned so perfectly with official conclusions. The eagerness with which certain villagers embraced Mrs. Rowan's guilt suggested motivations that had little to do with evidence and much to do with the comfort of blaming outsiders for local troubles. Inspector Slack's case. The inspector outlined his evidence with methodical confidence. Mrs. Rowan had indeed been Albert's final intended destination on Christmas Eve. The tampered Christmas card found in the snow bore her name and address in Albert's careful handwriting. Most damning, she claimed to have been alone and unwell that evening, with no witnesses to corroborate her alibi. Her cottage's isolated location near the old mill stream would have provided perfect cover for disposing of evidence. Furthermore, Slack continued, warming to his theme, "We have the matter of the Christmas Club funds. £50 is a considerable sum, more than enough motive for someone facing financial difficulties. A London woman, recently relocated, might well find herself in straitened circumstances." Beatrice Stone, however, raised a trembling objection that caught Miss Marple's attention. "Inspector, the Christmas Club money was found untouched in Albert's cottage safe, and Mrs. Rowan visited the post office on December 23rd, asking specifically about Albert's delivery schedule. She seemed anxious about receiving particular correspondence, not planning anything sinister." This detail troubled Miss Marple considerably. People planning crimes rarely advertised their interest in victims' schedules to official witnesses. Such behavior suggested anxiety rather than premeditation. Miss Marple's quiet doubts. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to Rosemary Cottage under the pretense of offering neighborly support. The walk along Millfield Lane provided opportunity for careful observation, and what she noticed contradicted several aspects of Inspector Slack's confident assertions. Mrs. Rowan, a woman of perhaps 45 with intelligent dark eyes and prematurely grey hair, received her unexpected visitor with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect hostility rather than kindness. Her cottage showed signs of careful habitation, but no evidence of hasty cleaning or concealment that might indicate recent violence. "You're very brave to visit me, Miss Marple," she said quietly, offering tea with slightly trembling hands. "The entire village seems convinced of my guilt in whatever has befallen Mr. Crowley." Miss Marple studied her hostess with gentle attention. Mrs. Rowan's distress appeared genuine rather than performed, and her concern for Albert's welfare seemed to stem from personal knowledge rather than general sympathy. Most significantly, she possessed the refined mannerisms of someone with education and breeding, hardly the desperate criminal Inspector Slack had described. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "perhaps you might tell me about the correspondence Albert was bringing you. Sometimes understanding the message helps explain what happened to the messenger." Mrs. Rowan's composure cracked slightly. "It was forwarded from London, a legal matter I'd hoped to keep private. But the envelope had been opened and resealed. Someone had read my private correspondence before Albert attempted to deliver it." This revelation cast Albert's disappearance in an entirely different light. Miss Marple recalled Timothy Fletcher's observation that Albert had been asking questions about former village residents, particularly families who had moved away years earlier. His stated intention to set old accounts straight suggested moral rather than criminal motivations. Deeper currents. As Miss Marple walked home through the gathering dusk, she reflected on the pattern emerging from seemingly disconnected observations. Albert's recent historical inquiries, the tampered correspondence, Mrs. Rowan's obvious distress about matters predating her arrival. All suggested that the faithful postman had discovered something requiring investigation rather than simple delivery. The Christmas card in the snow represented more than failed correspondence. It was evidence that Albert Crowley had uncovered secrets someone was willing to kill to protect, and his commitment to delivering difficult truths had made him a target for those with far more to lose than Christmas Club contributions. Inspector Slack might be satisfied with his obvious suspect, but Miss Marple knew that human nature was rarely so convenient. The real question was which of Little Wickham's seemingly respectable residents had been willing to silence their faithful postman to keep the past safely buried. The morning of December 29th brought an unexpected thaw that transformed Little Wickham's pristine snow cover into treacherous patches of slush and ice. Miss Marple, making her careful way along Millfield Lane with the ostensible purpose of gathering winter berries, discovered what the melting snow had revealed: Albert Crowley's small black notebook, half concealed beneath the hedge near the old stone bridge where his bicycle had been found. The leather-bound record, stained but miraculously preserved, contained far more than Albert's usual meticulous delivery notes. Page after page revealed a parallel investigation that had consumed his attention for several weeks, documenting careful research into village families, their histories, and, most significantly, their carefully guarded secrets. The Henderson Revelation. Constable Edwards, summoned by Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, read aloud the notebook's most startling entry. "ER is EH returned. Confirmed through London postal records. Mrs. Elspeth Rowan is Mrs. Elspeth Henderson, daughter seeking justice for family's wrongful treatment 15 years past. Legal correspondence confirms inheritance claims. Someone prevented proper delivery then. Must ensure justice this time." The tampered Christmas card took on entirely new significance. It had contained legal documents establishing Mrs. Rowan's claim to compensation for her family's forced departure from Little Wickham. Compensation that someone had intercepted, leading to the Henderson family's financial ruin and mysterious midnight disappearance. Miss Marple reflected on the cruel irony. The village had been so eager to blame the mysterious newcomer, never suspecting she was actually returning home to reclaim what had been stolen from her family years before. The physical evidence speaks. Albert's final entries, dated December 23rd and 24th, revealed his growing certainty about the conspiracy's scope. But it was Miss Marple's own sharp observation that provided the crucial physical link. She recalled the distinctive dark horn button found in Albert's cottage, the same type of button she had noticed missing from Colonel Hartwell's tweed overcoat during the Christmas Eve service. Her subsequent visit to the Laurels confirmed her suspicions. Under the guise of discussing the village charity bazaar, she observed Colonel Hartwell's nervous reaction when she mentioned the missing button. "Such a distinctive horn button," she remarked gently. "One might almost mistake it for a button from Albert's own coat, if one weren't paying close attention to details." The Colonel's bluster faltered noticeably. "Never found it. Probably lost in the snow." But his eyes darted toward his antique writing desk, a fleeting movement that spoke volumes to Miss Marple's trained observation. Gentle interrogation. At the post office, Beatrice Stone's revelations added another piece to the puzzle. "Albert seemed quite agitated about a letter from London," she confided. "He said it felt wrong somehow, that it had been opened." He mentioned recognizing the hand of an old enemy. This connected perfectly with Mrs. Rowan's account of the tampered correspondence. Someone with access to London mail, someone Albert considered an enemy from past dealings, had been intercepting and reading private correspondence just as they had 15 years earlier with the Henderson family's legal documents. Miss Marple's visit to Mrs. Pemberton yielded equally illuminating details. The young woman's nervousness, her pale rose lipstick that matched the crescent found on Albert's teacup, and most tellingly, her husband's hastily repaired overcoat with its mismatched replacement button, all suggested the Pembertons had been involved in Albert's final evening. Doctors are hard on clothes. Mrs. Pemberton had explained with a laugh she couldn't quite finish, but Miss Marple noted how her hands trembled as she served tea. The conspiracy unveiled. As Miss Marple walked home through the grey afternoon, the pattern became increasingly clear. Albert's investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into Little Wickham's most respected families. The Henderson property had been sold under distressed circumstances for below-market value, with the proceeds somehow enriching several current residents, including Dr. Pemberton, whose practice had been established with mysterious London funds shortly after the Henderson departure. Albert's notebook contained a final, ominous entry dated Christmas Eve morning. "Truth will out tonight. Justice for the Henderson family, whatever the cost." The faithful postman had not disappeared because of robbery or random violence. He had vanished because his commitment to delivering justice, like delivering mail, had made him a mortal threat to those who had built their prosperity on the Henderson family's ruin. Someone had been willing to silence Little Wickham's most trusted resident rather than face exposure of their 15-year-old crimes. The question now was which combination of the village's seemingly respectable residents had conspired to commit murder, and how Miss Marple would prove their guilt without Albert's testimony to support her gentle but devastating conclusions. The revelation of Mrs. Rowan's true identity as Elspeth Henderson had transformed Little Wickham's Christmas mystery into something far more sinister than a simple disappearance. Miss Marple, armed with Albert's notebook and her own keen observations, began the delicate process of unraveling 15 years of carefully concealed guilt. Her approach, as always, was gentle but relentless, like water wearing away stone through patient persistence. The lipstick's tale. Miss Marple's first visit was to the Pembertons, where she found Mrs. Pemberton arranging Christmas cards with trembling hands. The young woman's pale rose lipstick, so distinctive and refined, had left its mark on more than just teacups. "What a lovely shade you wear, my dear," Miss Marple observed gently, settling into the drawing-room chair. "So distinctive. I noticed it particularly on Christmas Eve. Such a becoming color for a young woman." Mrs. Pemberton's composure cracked like thin ice. "I didn't mean any harm," she whispered. "Albert sent word that he had questions about Nicholas's early practice, about charity subscriptions and the Henderson family. I went to beg him to be gentle, to consider how exposure might ruin my husband's reputation over old misunderstandings." The confession tumbled out in fragments. Dr. Pemberton's practice had indeed been established with funds connected to the Henderson property sale, though presented as legitimate charity work for distressed families. Mrs. Pemberton had pleaded with Albert to consider the consequences of his investigation, finding him kind but immovable in his commitment to justice. "He said truth does less harm than lies in the long run," she continued, tears threatening. "When I left, someone else was coming up the path. Colonel Hartwell, walking very purposefully. Beatrice Stone's burden." The postmistress received Miss Marple with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone carrying unbearable guilt. Surrounded by the familiar tools of her trade, stamps, scales, and sorting boxes, Beatrice finally unburdened herself of secrets that had festered for years. "Albert wrote about recognizing the hand of an old enemy," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was my husband's handwriting he meant. 15 years ago, when the Henderson affair happened, Mr. Stone had a terrible lapse of judgment. He was persuaded by certain gentlemen that intercepting specific correspondence would prevent unnecessary trouble for the village. The systematic mail tampering had been more extensive than anyone suspected. Legal documents, bank correspondence, even personal letters had been diverted, steamed open, and sometimes never delivered at all. The Henderson family's financial ruin had been orchestrated through careful manipulation of their correspondence, leaving them unable to respond to legal challenges or access crucial support. "My husband died knowing it was a sin," Beatrice continued, "but Albert discovered the pattern, found evidence in old postal records. He told me he meant to put everything right, whatever the cost to village harmony." The Colonel's military precision. Colonel Hartwell received Miss Marple in his study with the stiff bearing of a man preparing for an unpleasant duty. His tweed jacket bore a new button that matched neither the age nor grain of the original, a detail that had not escaped Miss Marple's sharp observation. "You visited Albert on Christmas Eve," she stated gently, arranging herself in the straight-backed chair. "After Mrs. Pemberton left, you went to discuss his investigation into the Henderson affair. The Colonel's military training had taught him when retreat was impossible. I went to remind him of his responsibilities," he admitted stiffly. "A postman holds the village's confidences. Without discretion, there is chaos. The Henderson matter was settled legally if certain parties made poor decisions that reflected their judgment, not criminal activity." But Miss Marple's gentle persistence revealed more than he intended. The Colonel had indeed struggled with Albert, losing the distinctive button in the process. Albert had fled toward Rosemary Cottage, clutching his post bag and notebook, leaving the Colonel shaken but alive. "I arranged the bicycle properly," he confessed with military precision. "A man of my training doesn't pass a disorderly scene without setting it right, but I didn't harm Crowley. He ran off, quite agitated, but uninjured." The web of complicity. As Miss Marple pieced together the testimonies, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The Henderson property had been systematically undervalued through intercepted correspondence, manufactured financial crises, and coordinated pressure from multiple village residents. Dr. Pemberton's practice, Colonel Hartwell's property improvements, even Mrs. Pike's advantageous purchase of Elm House, all had been financed through the Henderson family's orchestrated downfall. Albert's investigation had threatened not just individual reputations, but the entire social structure of Little Wickham. His notebook contained evidence of mail tampering, fraudulent property dealings, and coordinated deception spanning 15 years. Most damning of all, it revealed that Mrs. Rowan's current legal correspondence had been intercepted using the same methods, suggesting the conspiracy remained active. The missing pieces. Yet crucial questions remained unanswered. While Colonel Hartwell had admitted to confronting Albert and Mrs. Pemberton to pleading with him, neither had confessed to actual violence. The careful placement of Albert's bicycle and post bag suggested someone with both the physical strength to move an injured or deceased man and the presence of mind to stage the scene. Miss Marple walked home through the grey afternoon, her mind working methodically through the evidence. Albert had received at least 2 visitors on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Pemberton seeking mercy, Colonel Hartwell demanding silence. But his notebook's final entries suggested he had expected to complete his delivery to Mrs. Rowan, to finally provide her with the justice her family had been denied. Someone among Little Wickham's most respected residents had been willing to commit murder rather than face exposure. The question now was which member of the conspiracy had struck the fatal blow and where they had concealed Albert Crowley's body in the frozen landscape of their seemingly peaceful village. Miss Marple suspected the answer lay not in the obvious motives of greed or fear, but in the deeper currents of human nature that she had spent a lifetime learning to read. The morning of December 30th brought the grim discovery that transformed Albert Crowley's disappearance from mystery to murder. Young Timothy Fletcher, checking the mill wheel's winter damage as he did each year for old Mr. Henley, found what the recent thaw had cruelly revealed. Albert's body, carefully weighted with stones and concealed beneath the mill race, his faithful postman's uniform still intact despite 3 days in the icy water. Dr. Pemberton's examination, conducted with the grave professionalism that marked his better moments, confirmed what Miss Marple had increasingly suspected. Albert had died from a single, precise blow to the head, delivered with considerable force by someone both strong enough to move his body and methodical enough to conceal it in the mill's hidden depths. The murder weapon remained missing, but the calculated nature of the concealment spoke of intimate familiarity with the mill's seasonal patterns and mechanical workings. Inspector Slack's predictable conclusions. The discovery reinvigorated Inspector Slack's investigation, though his reasoning remained disappointingly narrow. Standing beside the mill race with official authority, he outlined his theory with the confidence of a man who believed complexity was merely the enemy of efficiency. "The evidence supports our assessment of Mrs. Rowan," he announced, consulting his notebook with bureaucratic precision. "She lured Crowley to the area under false pretenses, murdered him when he refused to surrender the correspondence, then used her knowledge of local geography to dispose of the body. The mill provided perfect concealment for someone familiar with its operation." Miss Marple, observing quietly from the stone bridge with her knitting, noted the fundamental flaws in this reasoning. Mrs. Rowan, as Elspeth Henderson, would indeed know the mill's geography, but so would any long-time resident. More significantly, the methodical concealment suggested not desperate improvisation, but careful planning, the work of someone emotionally detached enough to treat a neighbor's murder as a problem requiring efficient solution. The postmistress's burden. That afternoon brought an unexpected development that shifted the investigation's focus entirely. Beatrice Stone, arriving at the village hall where the body had been temporarily housed, collapsed upon seeing Albert's remains. Dr. Pemberton, summoned hastily, found her in a state of nervous exhaustion that went far beyond normal grief. "I can't bear it any longer," she whispered to Miss Marple, who had arrived with characteristic quiet efficiency. Albert knew about the letters, all of them, not just the Henderson correspondence, but others over the years. "My husband kept records, you see, hidden records of every piece of mail we were asked to delay." The confession tumbled out in fragments. The systematic mail tampering had been far more extensive than anyone suspected, involving not just the Henderson family but several other matters where certain village residents had benefited from preventing timely correspondence. Legal documents, bank notifications, even personal letters had been intercepted, steamed open, and sometimes destroyed entirely. Albert found the pattern in old postal records, Beatrice continued, her voice breaking. He said the Henderson case was just the beginning, that there had been others. He meant to expose everything, to clear every account, no matter who it hurt. Physical evidence and deeper mysteries. Miss Marple's careful examination of Albert's effects revealed details that troubled her considerably. His pocket watch, still clutched in his hand, had stopped at 11:47, but Albert, ever punctual, kept his watch 5 minutes fast to ensure prompt deliveries. The actual time of death, therefore, was closer to 11:52, a detail that would prove significant when alibis were examined. More puzzling was the discovery of a second Christmas card in Albert's inner pocket, this one addressed to Colonel Hartwell in Albert's careful handwriting. Unlike the card found in the snow, this envelope remained sealed, suggesting Albert had intended multiple deliveries on Christmas Eve. Confrontations, perhaps, rather than simple postal duties. Timothy Fletcher's additional observations proved illuminating. The mill wheel was deliberately jammed when I found him, the young man reported to Miss Marple during a carefully casual conversation. Someone had wedged stones into the mechanism to stop it turning. That takes real knowledge of the machinery and considerable strength to do properly. The web tightens. As news of Albert's murder spread through Little Wickham, Miss Marple observed how differently the various conspirators responded to the reality of violence. Colonel Hartwell's military bearing cracked completely, replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone whose moral code had been shattered by compromise. His admission to confronting Albert had clearly been incomplete. The colonel's knowledge of mill operations and his physical strength made him capable of both murder and methodical concealment. Dr. Pemberton appeared increasingly haggard, his professional composure undermined by mounting guilt. His wife's earlier confession about visiting Albert had implicated them both, while his medical knowledge would have enabled him to ensure death with a single, precise blow. Most tellingly, he avoided examining Albert's head wound too closely, claiming the water damage made detailed analysis impossible. Mrs. Rowena Pike's reaction proved most interesting of all. Rather than the theatrical grief Miss Marple might have expected, she displayed a calculating satisfaction barely concealed beneath appropriate expressions of shock. Her immediate suggestions about outside criminals and London connections seemed designed to deflect attention from local involvement. Miss Marple's growing certainty. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her cottage reviewing the day's revelations, she reflected on the terrible arithmetic of conspiracy and murder. Albert Crowley had died not for money or passion, but because his unwavering commitment to justice threatened the entire social structure certain villagers had built upon others' misfortune. The killer possessed not only physical strength and local knowledge, but the emotional detachment necessary to murder a neighbor and dispose of his body with calculated efficiency. Most crucially, they had been present at the mill on Christmas Eve, with sufficient motive to risk everything rather than face exposure of their crimes. The sealed Christmas card to Colonel Hartwell suggested Albert had planned multiple confrontations that evening, armed with evidence that could destroy several reputations simultaneously. Someone among Little Wickham's most respected residents had decided that murder was preferable to disgrace, and had acted with the cold precision of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. Miss Marple suspected the final revelation would prove both more complex and more tragic than Inspector Slack's simple theories suggested. The truth, when it emerged, would demonstrate that the greatest danger in seemingly peaceful villages often came not from strangers or obvious criminals, but from those whose respectability masked the ruthless determination to preserve their carefully constructed lies at any cost. The morning of December 31st brought Little Wickham its second shock in 3 days. The post office sorting room had been deliberately set ablaze during the night, destroying what Inspector Slack confidently declared to be crucial evidence in Albert Crowley's murder investigation. Miss Marple, however, observed the scene with the calm attention of someone who had anticipated such desperate measures from the moment Albert's body was discovered. The fire's calculated purpose. The blaze had been methodically planned rather than born of panic. While the shop front remained untouched, the sorting room bore the concentrated fury of someone seeking to destroy specific records. Miss Marple noted the careful folding back of the usual floor rug, creating access to the old safe, and the selective nature of the destruction. Postal records and correspondence files had been targeted while valuable stamps and cash remained untouched. Constable Edwards discovered traces of paraffin, but Miss Marple's sharper observation revealed more telling details. The back door key, found clutched in Beatrice Stone's trembling hand, showed soot only on its bow, the shaft wiped clean, evidence that someone had used the key from outside, then carefully returned it to avoid suspicion. Such a methodical mind, Miss Marple murmured to herself, watching Inspector Slack measure scorch marks with official precision. Someone who believes that destroying evidence is as simple as destroying paper. Beatrice's burden and foresight. Fortunately, Miss Marple's gentle suggestion the previous afternoon had borne fruit. Seeing Beatrice's mounting distress over her husband's old records, she had recommended, with characteristic understatement, that important papers were never truly safe where people expected them to be. The biscuit tin now resting in Miss Marple's knitting basket contained what the arsonist had risked everything to destroy. 15 years of carefully documented postal irregularities that painted a devastating picture of systematic mail tampering. Beatrice, wrapped in Dr. Pemberton's professional solicitousness, managed only a few whispered words to Miss Marple. Albert found the pattern in everything, not just the Henderson correspondence, but others over the years. My husband kept records of every piece we were asked to delay or redirect. Albert said it was time for a complete accounting. The psychological web tightens. Miss Marple began her most delicate work the following morning, conducting what appeared to be innocent social calls, but were actually carefully orchestrated psychological examinations. Her first visit was to Colonel Hartwell, where she mentioned, with apparent casualness, the curious matter of Albert's pocket watch. "Poor Albert, always so punctual," she observed, settling into the Colonel's study chair. "His watch stopped at 11:47, though I recall he always kept it 5 minutes fast to ensure prompt deliveries. One wonders what delayed him those final minutes on Christmas Eve." The Colonel's military composure flickered almost imperceptibly. He had admitted to confronting Albert, but claimed the postman had fled, alive and agitated. The timing, however, suggested a different sequence of events, one that placed Albert's actual time of death at 11:52 well within the window of the Colonel's admitted presence at the scene. The second Christmas card's significance. During her visit to the Pembertons, Miss Marple introduced another carefully chosen detail. The sealed Christmas card found in Albert's pocket, addressed to Colonel Hartwell in the postman's distinctive handwriting. "Such dedication," she remarked to Mrs. Pemberton, who grew increasingly pale as the conversation progressed. Even in his final hours, Albert was determined to complete all his deliveries. One can only imagine what message he felt so urgent to convey. Dr. Pemberton's reaction proved most illuminating. His usual professional composure cracked slightly as he inquired, with forced casualness, whether the card's contents were known. When Miss Marple gently indicated that sealed correspondence remained sealed, his relief was palpable and telling. Physical evidence and behavioral observations. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the mill with Timothy Fletcher revealed additional crucial details. The young mechanic's demonstration of how the wheel had been jammed showed the killer's intimate knowledge of the mill's operation and considerable physical strength. More significantly, Timothy pointed out scratches on the stonework that suggested recent tool use, marks that matched the pattern of surgical instrument. Whoever did this knew exactly how the mill worked in winter, Timothy explained earnestly, and they had proper tools, not just rocks, but something that could wedge tight and hold against the water pressure. Miss Marple noted this information with particular interest, recalling Dr. Pemberton's long-standing medical relationship with old Mr. Henley and his consequent familiarity with mill property. The doctor's possession of surgical instruments capable of both precise violence and mechanical manipulation provided disturbing connections between means, opportunity, and expertise. The village's changing dynamics. As news of the fire spread, Miss Marple observed how differently various residents responded to this escalation. Colonel Hartwell's military bearing showed increasing strain, his usual punctuality replaced by nervous energy and repeated checking of his pocket watch. His hands, she noted, bore faint but healing scratches, consistent with forcing stones into mill machinery. Dr. Pemberton became increasingly solicitous toward Beatrice Stone, insisting on medical supervision that effectively prevented her from speaking privately with investigators. His professional authority provided perfect cover for controlling potential witnesses, while his access to sedatives offered means of ensuring continued silence. Mrs. Rowena Pike's theatrical pronouncements about outside agitators and London criminals seemed designed to deflect attention from local involvement, but Miss Marple detected genuine satisfaction beneath the performance, the pleasure of someone whose own secrets remained safely buried while others faced exposure. The convergence of evidence. By evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage reviewing the day's revelations with growing certainty about the conspiracy's true scope. Albert's investigation had threatened not just individual reputations, but the entire social structure certain villagers had built upon the Henderson family's orchestrated downfall. The systematic mail tampering documented in Beatrice's preserved records revealed a pattern of criminal activity spanning 15 years, with Dr. Pemberton's medical authority providing both coordination and legitimacy to the scheme. The fire represented a desperate attempt to destroy evidence, but also revealed the killer's methodical mindset, someone accustomed to treating human problems as clinical challenges requiring efficient solutions. Combined with the precise nature of Albert's murder and the calculated concealment of his body, the pattern pointed to someone with both medical training and emotional detachment necessary for sustained deception. Setting the stage. Miss Marple understood that the final confrontation was approaching. Albert Crowley had died because his unwavering commitment to justice threatened those who had built prosperity on others' misfortune. The sealed Christmas card to Colonel Hartwell suggested Albert had planned multiple confrontations on Christmas Eve, armed with evidence that could destroy several reputations simultaneously. Someone among Little Wycombe's most respected residents had chosen murder over exposure, acting with the cold precision of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. The question now was how to arrange the final revelation in a way that would ensure justice for both Albert and the Henderson family, while protecting the innocent villagers who had been manipulated by 15 years of carefully maintained lies. As she prepared for sleep, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible arithmetic of conspiracy and murder. Tomorrow would bring the moment when truth could no longer be contained, when the gentle pressure of accumulated evidence would finally crack the facade of respectability that had concealed such devastating crimes. The postman who never reached Christmas morning would finally receive the justice he had died trying to deliver. New Year's Day dawned crisp and clear over Little Wycombe, the frost silvering the hedgerows like delicate lacework. Miss Marple had spent the morning in careful preparation, arranging her small sitting room with the precision of a general preparing for battle. The coal fire glowed warmly, casting dancing shadows across the round table where she had placed several carefully chosen objects. Albert's red Christmas card addressed to Colonel Hartwell, still sealed, a brown packet labeled in her neat script, copies for London solicitor, and most prominently, the small black notebook that had revealed so many secrets. The gentle trap springs. By 3 o'clock, her guests had assembled with the punctuality that marked Little Wickham's better residence. Colonel Hartwell arrived with military precision, Dr. Pemberton with his professional bag and composed demeanor, and Mrs. Rowena Pike breathless with curiosity. Miss Marple welcomed each with the fussing attention of a pleased hostess, pouring tea and arranging them in chairs that allowed her to observe every expression and gesture. "I thought it might be helpful," she began with characteristic mildness, "to discuss what memorial would best honor poor Albert's memory. Such a dedicated man, so committed to ensuring everyone received exactly what they deserved." Her blue eyes moved thoughtfully over the assembled faces, noting how Dr. Pemberton's hands rested too carefully on his medical bag, how Colonel Hartwell's gaze avoided the sealed envelope. She opened Beatrice Stone's rescued tin with deliberate ceremony, removing documents that made several people visibly uncomfortable. Albert discovered such interesting patterns in the postal records. 15 years of systematic correspondence tampering, all coordinated to benefit certain residents at the expense of others, particularly the Henderson family. The medical connection revealed. The curious thing about Albert's investigation, Miss Marple continued conversationally, was how thorough he had become. He even sought medical consultation for the stress it caused him. She produced a document from the tin that made Dr. Pemberton shift uncomfortably. "Albert visited you on December 22nd, Doctor, complaining of headaches and what he called moral distress over postal irregularities." Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat professionally. "Patient confidentiality, Miss Marple. Even in death, a physician must—" "Oh, but Albert gave me permission to discuss it," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "He was so worried about confronting respected citizens with evidence of wrongdoing. You prescribed laudanum, quite a strong dose for a man of Albert's constitution. He mentioned feeling drowsy but determined when he left your surgery." The prescription record, preserved in Beatrice's careful files, revealed more than medical treatment. Albert's symptoms, as described to Dr. Pemberton, included explicit anxiety about exposing the Henderson conspiracy and his intention to deliver justice on Christmas Eve, regardless of personal consequences. The psychological examination. Miss Marple rose to adjust the small lamp on her mantelpiece, its glass chimney slightly askew. "Dr. Pemberton, would you be so kind? My fingers aren't what they were, and there's a note tucked behind the chimney." Without thinking, the doctor reached into his bag and produced a narrow-bladed instrument, sliding it between glass and brass with surgical precision. He freed the paper in one fluid motion, then glanced at the blade's smear of soot and automatically wiped it clean on his handkerchief. "How instructive," Miss Marple observed mildly. "The right tool always comes to hand for those accustomed to using it." Albert's murder required such precision, a single blow delivered by someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy. The body concealed with mechanical expertise, using tools that suggested surgical training. Colonel Hartwell leaned forward. "See here, Miss Marple. If you're suggesting, I'm suggesting nothing, Colonel, merely observing that Albert's killer possessed 3 distinct qualifications: medical knowledge to ensure death with one blow, mechanical understanding to jam the mill wheel properly, and the emotional detachment to treat a neighbor's murder as simply another problem requiring efficient solution." The final evidence. The kettle on the hob began to whistle softly, sending steam across the room. Miss Marple moved to adjust it, accidentally directing the vapor toward the sealed red envelope. "How clumsy of me. Colonel, shall I put this safely away from the steam?" Dr. Pemberton rose with practiced efficiency. "Allow me," he said, reaching not for the envelope, but for the kettle, angling the steam more precisely over the sealed flap. His fingers tested the gum with the same deft pressure he had used on the lamp chimney, then caught himself and smiled blandly. "Steam can damage the paper. Indeed it can, Miss Marple said quietly, just as it damaged the Henderson family's correspondence 15 years ago. Albert discovered that Mrs. Rowan's current legal documents had been tampered with using identical methods. The same careful steaming, the same precise resealing, history repeating itself, with the same participants using the same techniques. The confession, Dr. Pemberton's professional composure, finally cracked. Albert was going to destroy innocent people over ancient mistakes. The Henderson situation was regrettable, but exposing it would have ruined families, destroyed practices, shattered the village's peace. My practice was built with those funds. I used them to help people, to serve this community for 15 years. So you followed him to the mill after Colonel Hartwell's confrontation, Miss Marple stated with gentle certainty. Albert was still determined to complete his delivery to Mrs. Rowan, to finally provide her family with justice. You couldn't allow that testimony to reach its destination. The confession, when it came, carried the clinical detachment that had enabled 15 years of systematic crime. Dr. Pemberton had indeed killed Albert Crowley, striking him down with his medical bag when the laudanum failed to incapacitate the determined postman. He had used surgical instruments to jam the mill wheel and concealed the body with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to solving problems efficiently. Justice delivered. As Constable Edwards arrived to make the arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the terrible cost of maintaining lies. Albert Crowley, the faithful postman who had never missed a delivery in 15 years of service, had finally completed his most important round, bringing justice to those who had waited so long to receive it. Mrs. Rowan, finally receiving the vindication her family deserved, thanked Miss Marple with quiet dignity. Albert died trying to deliver more than mail. He was delivering truth, and you've ensured it reached its proper destination. The village of Little Wickham would heal, Miss Marple knew, but it would never again take the simple reliability of its postal service or the complex motivations of its most respected residents entirely for granted. The new year dawned grey and quiet over Little Wickham, as if the village itself was holding its breath after the shocking revelations of the past week. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, watching frost patterns trace delicate moral illustrations across her windows, while the kettle hummed gently on the hob. The arrest of Dr. Pemberton had sent tremors through the community that would take months, perhaps years, to fully settle. The final accounting. Inspector Slack arrived that morning with the subdued demeanor of a man whose confident theories had been thoroughly dismantled by superior observation. The complete evidence, meticulously organized in Miss Marple's sitting room, painted a devastating picture of 15 years of systematic corruption. Beatrice Stone's preserved postal records revealed the conspiracy's staggering scope. Legal documents redirected, bank correspondence delayed, personal letters destroyed, all coordinated through the post office under the guise of protecting village harmony. Albert's investigation was motivated by justice, not revenge, Miss Marple explained to the inspector, pouring tea with steady hands. He hoped private conversations would lead to voluntary restitution for the Henderson family. His final Christmas card to Colonel Hartwell contained not accusations, but gentle warnings about moral obligations to past wrongs. The sealed envelope, when finally opened under official supervision, revealed Albert's characteristic compassion even in confronting wrongdoing. He had offered each conspirator the opportunity for confession and redemption, never anticipating that his mercy would be met with violence. Individual reckonings. Colonel Hartwell's military bearing crumbled entirely when faced with irrefutable evidence of his complicity. His final confession to Constable Edwards revealed the full extent of his involvement in the original Henderson affair, though he maintained his innocence in Albert's actual murder. I confronted Crowley at his cottage, demanded he consider the consequences. He admitted with military precision. When he refused to abandon his course, I followed him toward the mill, intending to reason further. But Pemberton was already there, and when I saw what had happened, his voice broke. I should have reported it immediately, but I ranged the bicycle properly and fled like a coward. The colonel announced his intention to sell his property and relocate to Scotland. His reputation in ruins, but his conscience finally clear. His departure would leave another gap in Little Wickham's social fabric. But Miss Marple understood that some wounds required complete healing rather than superficial treatment. Mrs. Rowena Pike's theatrical departure for an extended London visit fooled no one. Her immediate flight suggested deeper involvement than she cared to acknowledge publicly. Elm House, purchased so advantageously from the Henderson estate, would soon require new ownership as the legal machinery of restitution began its inexorable work. Beatrice Stone, freed from the burden of her husband's secrets, began the delicate process of restoring integrity to the postal service. Under Miss Marple's gentle guidance, she prepared a whole, complete accounting of the mail tampering incidents, ensuring that other affected families would receive belated justice where possible. Albert always said the post was sacred trust, she confided during one of Miss Marple's supportive visits. Every letter carried someone's hopes or fears, and we had no right to interfere with their delivery. Justice, finally delivered, Mrs. Elspeth Rowan, no longer hiding behind her assumed identity, met with Miss Marple in the cottage where her family's destruction had been planned so many years before. The legal documents Albert died trying to deliver established not only her rightful inheritance claims, but the fraudulent methods used to force her family's midnight departure from Little Wickham. My father never understood why his business correspondence stopped arriving, she explained, accepting Miss Marple's gentle hospitality with quiet dignity. We left believing ourselves failures, never suspecting we had been systematically betrayed by neighbors we trusted. The Christmas Club funds, discovered untouched in Albert's cottage safe, were distributed to their intended recipients with interest calculated by Miss Marple's careful arithmetic. Albert's final act of financial responsibility provided comfort to families who had trusted him with their savings. The village remembers. On 12th night, the children gathered in the village hall for a subdued celebration. The red Father Christmas coat hung empty from the proscenium, dignified in its solitude. Timothy Fletcher had cleaned and polished Albert's bicycle lamp, placing it in the post office window where it caught the thin winter sun like a beacon of remembrance. Miss Marple spoke briefly to the assembled families, reminding them that promises were the threads from which communities were woven, and that some people kept them even when it was dangerous to do so. Miss Marple's final reflection. As evening settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple poured a small sherry and sat by her window where the yew made its familiar silhouette. She thought not of villains, but of arrangements, how habits, letters, buttons, and watches laid the tracks for larger destinies. Albert Crowley had trusted that truth, once delivered, would find its proper address. The postman who never reached Christmas morning had finally completed his most important delivery, ensuring that justice reached its destination despite the terrible cost of its journey. In Miss Marple's considerable experience with human nature, such dedication to moral principles, even unto death, represented the finest qualities of ordinary people faced with extraordinary challenges. She raised her glass to promises kept and to the morning's post, delivered faithfully, whatever the weather. The inquest was held on a raw February morning in the parish hall, the sort of day when frost refused to yield and voices carried with unusual clarity through the still air. The coroner's verdict, murder by Dr. Nicholas Pemberton in furtherance of conspiracy to pervert justice, fell upon the assembled villagers like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of recognition through Little Wickham's carefully maintained social fabric. Inspector Slack, chastened by his investigative failures, called upon Miss Marple that evening with the awkward deference of a man learning uncomfortable truths about assumptions. "You saw what I missed entirely," he admitted, turning his hat nervously. "One doesn't expect village respectability to conceal such calculated evil." Miss Marple offered tea and gentle observations about how surface appearances, like ice on winter ponds, often concealed treacherous depths beneath. The departures and arrivals. Colonel Hartwell departed within the week, selling the laurels to a retired schoolmistress from Bath, who appreciated its Georgian windows but carried no knowledge of its troubled associations. His final conversation with Timothy Fletcher revealed the weight of his complicity. "Keep the village's wheels properly aligned, lad," he said with military precision, undermined by trembling hands. Timothy, who had learned to distinguish between rank and character, nodded gravely and watched the colonel's taxi disappear toward the railway station. Mrs. Rowena Pike's theatrical departure for an extended charitable sojourn in London fooled no one. Her fox stole hung briefly in the cleaner's window like a molting reputation before vanishing entirely. The village, with the cruel kindness of small communities, simply continued without her, the social vacuum filled by quieter, more genuine voices. Institutional restoration. Beatrice Stone transformed the post office into a model of transparent efficiency that would have made Albert proud. Glass panels now allowed public observation of the sorting process, while detailed logs recorded every piece of correspondence. Her small notice, receipts and records available for customer inspection on request, represented more than administrative reform. It embodied the village's commitment to preventing future deception. Inspector Craddock, Slack's thoughtful replacement, proved more receptive to Miss Marple's insights about human motivation. Their first meeting, over seed cake and Earl Grey, established a professional relationship built on mutual respect for careful observation and patient deduction. The Henderson legacy restored. Elspeth Rowan reclaimed both her family name and her rightful place in Little Wickham with quiet dignity that commanded universal respect. Her purchase of Rosemary Cottage represented not retreat, but restoration, transforming exile into homecoming. The legal settlement, negotiated through London solicitors with ruthless efficiency, provided substantial compensation while ensuring other victims of the mail tampering conspiracy received appropriate restitution. Her cottage garden flourished under careful tending, the windows gleaming with the attention of someone who had learned not to take domestic peace for granted. Miss Marple's frequent visits revealed a woman gradually healing from 15 years of displacement, her natural warmth emerging from behind defensive reserve. Timothy's inheritance. Timothy Fletcher accepted the temporary postman position with the solemn dedication of someone inheriting sacred responsibilities. Each morning, he wheeled Albert's carefully maintained bicycle through the village lanes, understanding that delivering mail represented more than moving correspondence. It embodied trust, reliability, and the sacred obligation to connect people across both geographical and emotional distances. Miss Marple presented him with Albert's polished bicycle bell, explaining it was for future machines that will make good, cheerful noises. Timothy's grin revealed the young man's growing understanding that strength and kindness were not opposing virtues, but complementary aspects of genuine character. Memorial and memory. The village memorial took practical form, a bright red postbox positioned at the crossroads where Millfield Lane met the main street. Its brass plate bore simple inscription, Albert Crowley, Faithful Postman, 1901-1925. Every letter delivered. Children posting their first letters learned Albert's story, understanding that postal service represented more than convenience. It embodied the sacred trust between neighbors. When Christmas returned, Timothy donned the red Father Christmas coat with endearing awkwardness, the beard refusing to sit straight on his lanky frame. The children considered this an improvement, while Miss Marple observed Elspeth standing at the back of the church, her eyes bright with tears that spoke of healing rather than grief. Miss Marple's garden wisdom. As spring arrived with unusual eagerness, Miss Marple tended her garden and reflected on the curious parallels between cultivation and detection. Both required patient observation, careful tending, and understanding that surface appearances often conceal deeper truths. Weeds, like lies, spread through underground networks requiring complete removal to prevent future contamination. The postman who never reached Christmas morning had finally completed his most important delivery, ensuring that justice reached its proper destination through the very dedication that had cost him his life. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, such endings, marked not by revenge but by restoration, not by punishment but by promises finally kept, represented the finest qualities of ordinary people facing extraordinary moral challenges. The Morning Post would continue arriving on schedule, delivered by hands that understood the sacred trust Albert had died defending. By the following Christmas Eve, little Wickham had transformed, in ways both subtle and profound, like a garden that grows stronger after careful pruning of diseased branches. Miss Marple, walking slowly toward St. Mary's through snow that fell with the same crystalline beauty as the previous year, observed how the village had grown around the wound left by Albert Crowley's murder, not ignoring the scar but integrating it into a stronger, more honest whole. The new postman's Christmas. Timothy Fletcher, now officially appointed after a year of exemplary service, wheeled Albert's carefully maintained bicycle through the village lanes with the confident bearing of someone who had grown into inherited responsibilities. The Father Christmas costume, carefully mended and properly fitted, transformed the lanky young man into a figure that honored tradition while embracing renewal. Children who had once mourned Albert's absence now looked forward to Timothy's cheerful visits, understanding that some traditions could honor the past while creating new joy. The red post box at the crossroads had become more than a memorial. It served as the village's heart, where residents left small tokens of remembrance and gratitude. Timothy's punctilious attention to these offerings, polishing the brass plate each morning and ensuring every letter received proper care, reflected Albert's influence extending beyond death through example rather than reproach. Elspeth's homecoming. Mrs. Elspeth Henderson, she had reclaimed her family name with quiet pride, hosted the village Christmas tea at Elm House, the very property from which her family had been dispossessed 15 years earlier. The symbolism was not lost on anyone, yet her grace and victory spoke to a character that had been strengthened rather than embittered by suffering. Rosemary Cottage remained her private sanctuary, while Elm House became a center of community healing, its rooms filled with warm light and genuine hospitality. Miss Marple, accepting perfectly brewed Earl Grey and excellent seed cake, noted how Elspeth's hands no longer trembled when serving former enemies. The legal settlements had provided financial security, but the village's gradual acceptance had restored something more precious, the sense of belonging that had been stolen along with her family's reputation. Institutional renewal. Beatrice Stone moved through the post office with the efficiency of someone whose conscience had been cleared of 15 years' burden. The glass-paneled sorting area and detailed public logs represented more than administrative reform. They embodied the community's commitment to preventing future deceptions. Her mentorship of Timothy reflected not just professional training but moral education, teaching him that postal service carried sacred trust between neighbors. Inspector Craddock, making his quarterly visit with casual thoroughness, complimented the transformation. Remarkable how honesty spreads once given. Proper soil, he observed to Miss Marple over tea. Like good gardening, requires initial effort but produces lasting benefits. The children's understanding. The village children, with their remarkable capacity for integrating difficult truths into manageable narratives, had transformed Albert's story into a moral tale about keeping promises despite danger. Their Christmas play, performed with endearing earnestness in the parish hall, featured a brave postman who delivered important messages regardless of obstacles. Miss Marple, watching from the front pew, observed how their innocent interpretation had captured essential truths about courage, duty, and the cost of maintaining integrity. Justice's quiet victory. Dr. Pemberton's life sentence had concluded the legal proceedings without theatrical spectacle, allowing the village to heal without constant reminders of its trauma. His former practice, assumed by a young physician with impeccable references and transparent methods, gradually earned trust through competent care unmarked by hidden agendas. The new doctor's straightforward manner helped heal wounds extending beyond physical ailments. Mrs. Pemberton had departed quietly for Cornwall, carrying the village's grudging sympathy for someone who had loved unwisely rather than criminally. Her occasional letters to Beatrice, forwarded through proper channels, spoke of gradual acceptance of consequences earned rather than imposed. Miss Marple's enduring wisdom. As the Christmas Eve service concluded with familiar carols sung by voices that had learned to harmonize around absence rather than pretending it didn't exist, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar mathematics of community healing. Albert's murder had revealed corruption that might have festered for generations, while his death had provided the catalyst for moral renewal benefiting future residents. Walking home through snow that crunched with musical quality, Miss Marple considered how human nature remained both her greatest puzzle and most reliable constant. At her cottage gate, she found a small package from Timothy, a polished brass button from Albert's coat with a note, "For remembering." The button caught the lamplight like a small star, reminding Miss Marple that some gifts arrive exactly when needed, delivered by hands understanding the sacred trust between neighbors. The postman, who never reached Christmas morning, had finally completed his most important delivery, ensuring truth reached its proper destination despite the terrible cost of its journey. In her considerable experience, such endings, marked by restoration rather than revenge, by promises kept rather than punishments inflicted, represented the finest qualities of ordinary people facing extraordinary moral challenges. The morning post would continue arriving on schedule, delivered by hands that understood what Albert Crowley had died defending. The simple, sacred trust holding communities together, one letter at a time.